All right, moving into the last part of the semester, we are going to start discussing exercise prescription and what is recommended by the American College of Sports Medicine. This first lecture is going to be about exercise prescription for improving and maintaining cardiorespiratory fitness, also known as aerobic fitness. All right, so before we get into the specifics, I think it's a good idea to revisit the key principles of training. There are other principles of training, but these three are three of the major principles of training. So, principle of overload, which basically says that for something to improve, you have to subject it to a stimulus that it's not used to or it's not accustomed to. So, that could mean just like stressing the body in different ways. A great example of this is just weightlifting. To get stronger, you constantly overload the muscles with more and more weight. You could also apply it to the cardiovascular system to improve the function of the cardiovascular system. You can do aerobic exercise at higher intensity, longer duration, but you're constantly overloading the systems of the body, and that's how you're going to see improvement. So you have to think about that when you're designing an exercise program. And then principle of specificity just means that training adaptations are specific, and this could be located location-wise. So upper body versus lower body. It could be a different system of the body, aerobic versus anaerobic pathways. So that the way you train is you're going to get adaptations in that are specific to that type of training. So if you only do anaerobic training, you can expect to see improvements in your anaerobic capacity, but not necessarily aerobic and so forth and so on. And then principle of reversibility, sometimes just called the principle of detraining or deconditioning, basically says that if you stop training, all the adaptations that you got can start to reverse and go back to where they were. So you can also apply this in the sense that you don't want to take too big of breaks in the training program to allow someone to lose the training adaptations that they've gained. So goals of a common exercise prescription could be a variety of goals, but obviously to improve physical fitness, improve health, so also improving the risk factors, blood pressure, glucose, etc. And also, at the same time, you want to ensure safety for the participant and design it in a manner that someone can effectively and safely exercise, ideally on their own, but even with supervision. So not all these goals are equally important for everyone. So the key word that I always associate with exercise prescriptions is individualized. So you should individualize an exercise prescription for a specific person because not everybody's going to have the same goals, etc. All right, so the major components of an exercise prescription, there are four key ones, and then they've recently added two more. But you can think of these, an easy way to remember these is the FIT principle. So frequency is how often you exercise, intensity is how hard, type is what you're actually doing, what the mode is, time is how long, also known as duration. And then, so that's the FIT part of this. And then the VP, volume and progression. So total volume is important. Also, it's important to progress as you over time to constantly overload and keep gaining and maintaining adaptations to the body. So as you're designing this, again, individualized is the key word. So consider things like the person's goals, what they're interested in. So you wouldn't want to recommend that someone run on the treadmill if they don't like running. So you got to find something that people are interested in, and also what they're able to do. So their abilities, and then also their initial fitness level. So if they're very deconditioned, you want to design something where they can easily do it at a low or light intensity, and then gradually progress from there. So the major components of a training session, you can think of it as three things. You got a warm up period, and then the main part of an exercise session, which I would just refer to as the meat and potatoes of an exercise session, is called the conditioning component, and that could include aerobic exercise, weightlifting, resistance training, or even sport-related exercise. Like if you're like an athlete and you engage in basketball games or play tennis or something like that, that actually could be the conditioning phase of the training session as well. Then that's followed by a cool down. So as far as flexibility, it's kind of up to the person to where you want to include flexibility as part of a program. Some people include dynamic type stretching as part of a warm up or shortly after the warm up. And some people do more intense stretching after the conditioning phase as part of the cool down or just before the cool down. You can also do flexibility exercises instead of the conditioning phase. You could have an entire exercise session devoted to stretching, and that's totally reasonable. So, the big thing about flexibility, we'll talk a little bit more about this with the stretching recommendations. But the big thing about flexibility, generally you don't want to do intense static stretching at the beginning of an exercise session or as part of the warm up. So you wouldn't want to save intense static type training and any intense stretching after the muscles are warmed up and body temperature is elevated a little bit. So going back to the warm up, following the ACSM recommendations, they say 5 to 15 minutes. 15 minutes to me sounds a little bit long, but it could be 15 minutes depending on the person. Uh, what does a warm up consist of? So light to low intensity, up to moderate intensity exercise. So I put the ranges here. So moderate, go back to 40 to 60% of VO2 reserve. And then as far as movement, so movements that would occur during a warm up. So light aerobic activity, muscular endurance activity, maybe some jumping jacks, some light plyometrics, um, just anything to kind of get the blood flowing in the body to increase blood flow and also increase body temperature. And as I mentioned earlier, dynamic type movements are a lot better for related to performance anyway than static. There is some evidence that like intense static stretching before exercise does or it can impair your performance. Benefits of a warm up, there's a lot of them. So, increased metabolism, increased blood flow to active tissues, increasing body temperature, stretches, loosens up the muscles and tendons, and also potentially injury prevention. And that could be musculoskeletal injuries by elevating the body temperature, or even cardiovascular by increasing blood flow to the heart. So, it's not a shock to the heart if you just start exercising. So, you're gradually increasing blood flow towards the key organs of the body. So for the conditioning phase, big part of the exercise program, general recommendation 10 to 60 minutes. Obviously 10 is pretty short, but for some individuals that might be appropriate, a fine place to start. 60 minutes is relatively long for most people, but that's kind of the general range that's recommended. So it should include aerobic activity, also resistance training and flexibility, whether flexibility is its own session or part of the cool down as well. That could also be an option. So, and additionally, it could be also sport related exercise, like maybe you're playing a tennis match. That could be the conditioning phase. And then the cool down, 5 to 10 minutes, low to moderate intensity, aerobic muscular endurance activity, kind of the opposite of a warm up. Whereas a warm up, you're kind of ramping up the intensity slowly. With a cool down, you're bringing it back down. And so, benefits of an active cool down, bring blood pressure, heart rate back towards resting values. Probably the biggest thing, maintain venous return. We have a skeletal muscle pump. If you're walking or cycling, the pumping action of your legs is helping return blood back to the heart. And so if you keep doing this during recovery, it's going to help maintain that. If you just stop and sit there, it's possible that blood might start pooling in your lower body, and you might have some symptoms like getting lightheaded, or it could actually, in worst case scenario, reduce blood flow back to the heart, which could lead to cardiovascular problems. Also reduces what's called post-exercise hypotension, whether we like it or not. After an exercise session, primarily aerobic, your blood pressure tends to drop a little bit. It's called post-exercise hypotension. So that's generally a good thing, but an active cool down, in some sense, kind of prevents it from going too low, because it could be problematic if your blood pressure drops too much after exercise. Also, other things, clearing hormones, lactate, other metabolites, and also keep removing and facilitating body heat from the body. Facilitate the removal of body heat from the body. All right, so as far as the aerobic component of this, the cardiorespiratory fitness component, what we should do to improve and maintain our cardiorespiratory fitness. By doing this, we can expect anywhere from a 5 to 30% increase in VO2 max in response to cardiorespiratory training. And a couple of things to think about why there's such a large range there. So, a few things I think of genetics plays a huge role here. So, some people are just genetically predispositioned to have a higher VO2 max than others, so just naturally aerobically fit. That explains some of it. And also the initial level of fitness. If you start on the lower end, if you're pretty deconditioned, you have a greater window to actually improve. So you might see massive changes in VO2 max if you're starting at a really, really low level. Whereas if you're starting kind of high already, there's limited area that you can actually improve. So that explains why there's such a big range here. So when we apply the recommendations to designing an exercise program for someone, we again go back to this FIT VP principle, that frequency, intensity, time, type, volume, progression, and that's basically what we're going to follow for the rest of this. So as far as mode or the type of exercise, what's generally recommended are activities that involve large muscle groups over prolonged periods that are rhythmic and aerobic in nature. And that's a long-winded way of describing a lot of these movements. But if you think about what type of exercise fits into that, we're thinking about things that we do all the time. So walking, jogging, running, cycling, elliptical training, cross-country skiing, any type of aerobic or endurance exercise modality that you generally see at a gym or any place like that, that generally would be appropriate here. So as you can tell, it's a pretty vague recommendation. So it's not specific. It's not saying that everybody needs to walk, everybody needs to run, everybody needs to cycle. I think it's nice that they have this general vague recommendation because a benefit of this is that it allows people to do what they like to do. So if you like to run, you can run. If you like to bike, you can bike. If you like to go to the gym and get on the elliptical, you can do that as well. So it's not kind of forcing people to do things that they don't want to do. So considerations when you're choosing modality of exercise. Impact is important. So something like running is generally considered a high impact activity, jogging as well, whereas walking would be considered a lower impact activity. Cycling, low impact. Swimming would be like non-impact. But that can be important when we try to think about people with certain conditions. Like if someone has issues with their knees or ankles, you probably want to stay away from high impact activities, like where they're going to be jumping up and down a lot. So in someone like that, you could focus more on the lower impact activity. So one rough way to tell the difference between a high impact and a low impact activity is whether or not your feet actually leave the ground at the same time. So if you think about running, there's actually a point while you're running where both feet are off the ground, where if you compare that to walking, one foot is always on the ground. So walking, low impact, running, higher impact. And then the other big consideration here is weight bearing. So it just means if you're supporting your own body weight. So weight bearing activity is generally good for most individuals. It's good for your bones. It puts a lot of stress on your bones. There's a lot of stress on your muscles, and those systems adapt to it. So weight bearing activity, anything where you're standing up, walking, jogging, running, elliptical, all those are weight bearing activities. Whereas something like riding a bike would be a non-weight bearing activity because you're actually sitting down on the seat. You're not actually bearing your own weight. So this may have implications also when you're trying to find a good activity for someone. If they can do weight bearing activity, I would generally recommend it. But for some individuals, it might be too much. Someone who's maybe morbidly obese, it might be hard for them to do 10 to 15 minutes of continuous weight bearing activity. So you might want to investigate some other options that are non-weight bearing just to get them through the initial phase of that exercise program. This is a grouping of activities by ACSM that it's in your book, page 167. But it kind of groups the exercises into different groups based on some general things. So like if you look at A, B, C, D, Starting A is pretty the simplest. So endurance activities requiring minimal skill. So this would be good for most people. So things like walking, leisurely cycling, uh, like water aerobics, just things that are simple and they don't require a lot of skill to do. So something most people could do. And then in the B category, you got vigorous activities, still require minimal skill. It's just the intensity is actually going up a little bit. So like jogging, running, aerobics, spinning, elliptical exercise, etc. So a lot of the stuff you're going to recommend is probably coming out of B and some A. And then as you get into C and D, it requires more and more skill. So this may be appropriate for some, but for most individuals, I think these are probably going to be, I think for most people, it'd probably be in the B or the A when you're recommending exercises. But again, you might come across someone who has a lot of skill in a certain area, so like swimming, cross country skiing, skating, that type of thing. And then D is more sport related. So tennis, basketball, downhill skiing, even hiking, depending on what type of hiking you're doing. Something that requires at least an average level of fitness and is more sport related. So again, there's nothing necessarily magic about these different groups, but it just gives you some ideas. So if you're looking for some activities, you're wondering if an activity is appropriate for someone, you can see what group is recommended for different adult groups, and then kind of go from there when deciding on an optimal modality of exercise. So regarding the frequency, which is how many times a week you would exercise, general recommendation 3 to 5 times a week for aerobic fitness, and that can if you want to know some numbers to really memorize, 150 of moderate intensity activity is generally the minimal recommendation, and that's per week. And then 75 minutes of vigorous activity per week. That's the minimum. So the range that's given, obviously, for moderate 150 to 300, and then for vigorous 75 to 150. So the general recommendation is doing a combination of these, which is probably going to happen in most cases anyway. And at the time uh, duration should actually be in there somewhere. So you can do a combination of those just to kind of meet those goals. Some other considerations: duration is going to interact with intensity. So if you're doing higher intensity exercise, you generally can do it fewer times per week, and vice versa. Where the 3 to 5 times a week come from? There's a lot of research out there looking at frequency, and a lot of this was done a long time ago. But what they consistently found that after about 3 times a week, you don't really improve that much more. So 3 times a week is kind of like that threshold for aerobic exercise that you want to get to. And then once you start going after up more than 5 times a week, you get minimal improvement after that. So 3 to 5 times a week seems to be that like sweet spot. So, however, there are individuals that do exercise more than 5 days a week. So you have to be really careful and kind of plan it out. So one of the reasons you have to be really careful is after about 5 times a week of exercising, the injury rate does go up, and it's a lot of just overuse of the body parts, of muscles, etc. Excessive stress on the joints. So that can be problematic if they're doing too much. And that's what I was saying, that you have to be really careful in how you do this if you're going to exercise more than 5 times a week. So considering the exercise modality, so if you're running a lot, maybe mix in some cycling, some swimming with it, some non-weight bearing activity, just to let the body kind of recover a little bit on certain days. Instead of running, say, 7 days a week, which would be hard on most people, you can run 3 to 4 days a week, and on the other days, do some light activities, some light cycling, some swimming, etc. As far as duration, the way this is written, again, you see the 150 to 300 for moderate, 75 to 150 for vigorous. But when you look at an individual session, moderate, they say 30 to 60, vigorous 20 to 60. It just depends. And for most people, as I said earlier, it's going to be a combination of moderate and vigorous. And then, so other things to consider. If one of the key goals is caloric expenditure to lose weight, you want to be on the upper end of all those ranges. So closer to 300 minutes per week of moderate intensity or 150 minutes a week of vigorous. But otherwise, those somewhere in those ranges are generally recommended. And then if you can't do it like uh, 20 or 30 minutes of continuous exercise, there's always the option to do intermittent bouts. So what that means is that you might be able to do, you might not be able to do 20 minutes continuous, but you can do 10. So you can do 10 minutes, take a break, do 10 more minutes, take a break, and even 10 more. Or that could be as low as 5 minutes. It used until recently, the recommendation was the minimum interval should be about 10 minutes, but they have actually kind of backed off from that, saying even if you can't do 10 minutes of continuous exercise, for instance, 5 minutes is enough. 5 minutes, take a break, do another 5 minutes. So you want to accumulate up to these recommended ranges. As far as intensity, which is probably the most complex of all this, again, interrelated with duration. So this is what's recommended. So the combination of moderate and vigorous intensity activity. So remember, moderate intensity is 40 to 59.9% of heart rate reserve or VO2 reserve. If you're looking at a straight percentage of heart rate max, it's 64 to just below 77. And then if you're using METs, 3 to 5.9. Vigorous is 60 to 89 for the heart rate reserve or VO2 reserve, and 77 to 95 if you're using a straight percentage of heart rate max, and then 6 to 8.7 for METs. So it kind of begs the question, what's beyond 89? They just call it like maximal or near maximal intensity, which is generally not recommended unless you're doing some type of interval training. So other things to consider, it is possible to do light, which would be below moderate, 30 to 39% heart rate reserve, VO2 reserve, or 57 to 63% of heart rate max. That might be appropriate in someone who's really, really deconditioned, not accustomed to exercising. And then, as I mentioned, interval training is also an option. And so there's different ways to do this, and the specifics are kind of beyond the scope of what we need to talk about right now, but everyone's probably heard of high intensity interval training, where you do like 4 minutes of really, really high intensity activity and have about a few minutes of rest, maybe 3 minute lower intensity activity, and then go again high intensity for another 4 minutes. So put 4x4, that's pretty standard. So 4 bouts of 4 minutes of high intensity exercise. Then another option is sprint interval training. It's a similar concept, but generally when we talk about sprint interval training, they're actually during the sprinting phase, it's really short. I put an example of 20 seconds, but the intensity is generally above maximal. So they call it a super maximal bout, meaning that you would be at 110 to 120% of your VO2 max. So a really, really high intensity, but obviously it's going to be for a very, very short duration. Then recover and do it again. So those are options as well. There's less research on these two. At least with the sprint interval training, there's more and more information on the high intensity interval training, but definitely it's effective at increasing your aerobic capacity, your VO2 max, but you also have to be just kind of careful on what you're doing and minimizing the risk of anything negative happening, like any injury, etc. All right, so how to prescribe intensity. So I'm going to go through several ways to do this, but one of the probably the most accurate way to do this is use something called VO2 reserve. So VO2 reserve is just the difference between your VO2 max and your VO2 at rest. So we're going to assume that VO2 at rest in most people is 1 MET, which is the equivalent of 3.5 milliliters per kilogram per minute of oxygen consumption units. And so and the VO2 max could be whatever. So if someone had a VO2 max of, 50, and we wanted to calculate their VO2 reserve, and we're assuming that their resting VO2 is 3.5, their VO2 reserve would be 46.5. So you just subtract the resting, that 3.5, from their max. So an example I can run through really quick, calculate a target VO2 range for someone who wants to exercise at an intensity of 70 to 80% of VO2 reserve. So first thing we do, you'd have to know something. So you'd be given something, be given their VO2 max. Well, I'll just put 50. Well, we're always going to assume the VO2 rest unless we know otherwise. We're going to assume it's 3.5. So the VO2 reserve would be 46.5. And then we just multiply that 46.5 by the two ends of the percentages. So we want to exercise between 70 and 80% of their VO2 reserve. So we'd multiply that 46.5 by zero point 0.7 and then again by 0.8 to get the two ends of that spectrum. So 70% would 46.5 times 0.7, and then we add 3.5 back. That's because you can't just ignore that resting component. So you get the VO2 reserve, multiply it by the percentage, and then you add the resting back. That gives me about 36. I do the same for 80%, and I get 40.7. So their recommended range, VO2 range, is about 36.1 to 40.7 milliliters per kilogram per minute. So this is probably the most abstract method, even though, like I said, it's the most accurate, because a lot of people don't know what to do with this. Like, you might get this target VO2 range of 36 to 40, but what does that mean to the average person? To the average person, to be honest, it's probably not going to mean a whole lot. So one way to do this, what we're going to look into soon, is we could actually calculate, depending on what the person wanted to do, if they wanted to be on a treadmill, we could calculate the treadmill speed and grade that they need to be at to hit those VO2 numbers. So in other words, we could prescribe a treadmill speed and grade to elicit a VO2 of 36. And we would say that's the lower end that you want to be on when you're on the treadmill, that speed and that grade. And then we could also calculate the speed and grade that would elicit about 41, a VO2 of about 41. And that would be the upper end. So we could just say stay between these two ranges and you're fine. That way you ensured that they're in the right target zone that you're prescribing. Now, obviously, the other way, if you actually measured VO2, you could do it, but most people in the real world are not going to be hooked up to a metabolic cart measuring oxygen consumption while they're exercising. All right, heart rate is by far the most commonly used method to monitor or prescribe exercise intensity. And the first thing you generally need if you're going to use heart rate is to know what the max heart rate is for somebody. So most methods that use heart rate require an estimation or a true max heart rate. So if you know the true max heart rate, you don't need to do any of this. And the only way to really get a true max heart rate is to do a VO2 max test or a maximal graded exercise test and see how high the heart rate actually gets. And that's it. Most people don't do that, so we can estimate it. So remember the 220 minus age. You can still use it. It's easy. Most people know what it is. But if you want a little more accuracy, they have these other equations. And so obviously it's harder to commit these to memory. But you can see like this one for ages 4 to 34. This is supposed to be a relatively accurate equation. This one just says healthy males, females, so this one's totally fine. Gellish, this one I've actually used a fair amount. So adult males and females. And then there's this one. These are individuals that are referred for stress testing, and specifically females. So this one's a little unique, but if you did have someone who fit into that group, you might want to use that equation. So there's multiple options for this other than the 220 minus age equation. All right, so different ways to use heart rate to prescribe intensity include just the simplest is just use a straight percentage of heart rate max. I actually do not recommend using this one very much because it has some, doesn't give you a whole lot. It doesn't take a lot into account. You'll see what I mean as we go through this. So basically all it is you calculate a target heart rate range for someone based on their max heart rate. And you just take a straight percentage of their maximal heart rate. So let's say that someone has a heart rate max of 180. We just multiply 180 by 0.8 because if I'm looking for 80 to 85% of their maximal heart rate, and then I do it again by 0.85, I get those numbers. That's the target heart rate range. So again, this is the simplest way to do this. But again, you lose a lot of accuracy when you use this technique because it does not take into account their resting heart rate, which can be indicative of their fitness level. So that's where this method comes in. The Carbonin method, also known as the heart rate reserve method, very similar to the VO2 reserve method. So for this, it does take heart rate into account. This is, if I'm going to use a heart rate method to calculate exercise intensity, this is the one I would recommend. So looking at this example, we'll just talk through it. Calculate a target heart rate range for someone who wants to exercise at an intensity of 60 to 65% of heart rate reserve. So you would need to know two things going in: their maximal heart rate and their resting heart rate. So either you have to figure that out or it'll be given to you. So if we know max and we know rest, we have to calculate heart rate reserve. And just like VO2 reserve, it's just max minus rest. So the heart rate reserve in this case would be 120, just 180 minus 60. And then we're looking for 60 to 65%. So we put 120 times 0.6, and that gives us 72. And then just like VO2, we have to add the resting back. And the resting heart rate is 60, so that gives me 132 on the lower end. Then at the 65%, we do the same thing, and we get 78 plus 60 is 138. So the target heart rate range for this example, 132 to 138. Again, I think this is a better way to do it because it does take into account the resting heart rate. Right, other ways, this slide gets a little wordy, but it's not overly complex. You can also, just like we use a straight percentage of heart rate, you can also just use a straight percentage of VO2. So it would just be VO2 max times whatever intensity you want to work at. Again, not as accurate because it does not take into account the resting component. You can do the same thing with METs. If you want to convert VO2 to METs, same thing. So if you want to find a target MET level, find the VO2 max divided by 3.5. That's basically your VO2 max in MET units. And then multiply by whatever intensity you want to work at. And then something that could be useful if you're exercising, you can work backwards, just go different ways to do this, but if you want to calculate what heart rate someone needed to be at a certain MET level, or vice versa, if someone's exercising at a given heart rate and you want to determine what MET level they're at, you can use this technique. It's called the heart rate index equation. And basically, heart rate index is just your exercise heart rate divided by your resting heart rate. And then to determine the MET level, this equation, 6 is the standard. So 6 times heart rate index minus 5, that's going to tell you what MET level you're at based on your exercising heart rate. So I put an example here to try to make it clear. But let's say someone has a resting heart rate of 60 beats per minute. And when they're exercising, their heart rate's 150. So if I wanted to determine what MET level they're at, I would calculate the heart rate index. No, just 150 divided by 60. So exercise heart rate divided by resting heart rate gives me 2.5. And then the MET level associated with that, 6 times 2.5 minus 5. So that gives us 10 when I do all those calculations. So someone exercising at a heart rate of 150 beats per minute is exercising at an intensity of about 10 METs. So that's a one way to kind of convert between heart rate and METs. All right, other ways of prescribing intensity, RPE. So this is the same 6 to 20 scale that we've seen during exercise testing. And recommended range generally 12 to 17 as far as exercise sessions would go. And that's the reason is that represents about 40 to about 89% of heart rate reserve / VO2 reserve. And I kind of highlighted or bracketed on the 6 to 20 scale where that would be. So as you make your way from 12 towards 17, you're basically progressing from moderate to vigorous. So according to textbooks anyway, people are given RPEs of 12 to 13. They're generally in the moderate range. 14 to 17, more vigorous range. So if you want to prescribe vigorous activity, can't monitor heart rate or anything else, you can still go back to RPE and have someone exercise based on their perceived exertion. Then related to volume, there's the volume part of this, obviously. So there's a lot of stuff going on here, but a couple of numbers here are pretty important. So as far as kilocalories per week, there is what's thought to be a minimal threshold to get a lot of health benefits, and that's about 1,000 kcals a week of physical activity. And if someone's doing about 150 minutes of moderate intensity exercise, which is consistent with the recommendations, that's going to put you in that range. So that's going to equal about 1,000 kcals a week. Uh, if someone's really deconditioned, they can actually see improvements with less than that. So I've seen health-related improvements in deconditioned individuals as low as like 500 kcals a week. But again, for the average, apparently healthy person, 1,000 seems to be a good threshold to shoot for. If you can get to 2,000, even better, because you're going to get even more health benefits and actually, obviously, a lot more caloric expenditure. So that might be something to shoot for if weight loss is a key goal. So in addition to looking at kcals per week, you can also use something called met minutes per week, or calculate met minutes per week. And the recommended range is at least 500 to 1,000. I know that's a big range there, but a met minute per week is calculated by just the met level associated with an activity times the minutes that it's done. So let's say you were doing an activity like, I don't know, jogging, and the met level was 6, and you did that um, for 150 minutes over the course of a week. You could just multiply 6 times 150, and that's going to give you the met minutes per week. It's actually that simple. Um, and I'll actually go through an example on the upcoming slide about it, but it is that simple. But a lot of times they put it in these units, met minutes per week, just so you can kind of see the interrelation between intensity, which is where the met comes in, and the minutes, which is the duration. So other things to consider with volume, there is evidence that overuse injuries generally occur with once you get it to like 3,500 to 4,000 kcals a week. So you just got to be really careful if you're doing intense training, just making sure you get adequate recovery time. And then a lot of people still look at steps per day with all the activity trackers on the market these days. So I know 10,000 steps was classically the recommendation per day, but based on most of the research out there, you get a lot of health benefits if you can hit 7 to 8,000. So the minimum threshold if you're using pedometer steps is about 7,000 to 8,000 steps a day, and that's where you're going to start getting significant health benefits. All right, so this is the example I wanted to talk through. So just calculating volume, you can do it kcals per week, you can do it met minutes per week. But some of this is going to draw back to some calculations that you likely learned in exercise phys and other parts of this course. So let's say a 70 kilogram person walks an intensity of 5 mets. They do it 4 times a week, and every time they do it at 60 minutes. So if we look at just the minutes per week, 4 times a week, 60 minutes each time, that's 240 minutes per week that they're actually exercising at an intensity of 5 mets. So all we need to do is multiply that 240 times the 5. And what I did here is I had the 5, and I just did the long drawn out version, 4 times a week, 60 minutes. So I'm going to get someone doing this would be at 1,200 met minutes per week. And obviously, based on what we said on the previous slide, that actually is in the acceptable range. That's over 1,000 met minutes a week. So getting into units of kcals per week, you have to do a little bit more math here, but this is actually calculating what I would call the gross energy expenditure, because it's going to include rest, which is fine, but you just need to know that going in what you're getting. So we're going to do this. We have 5 mets times 3.5. That's going to give us the VO2 associated with that activity. So every time they're walking at 5 mets, their VO2 is estimated to be 17.5, and that's just 5 times 3.5. 3.5 is our standard conversion for mets. So then we just need to convert that relative VO2 in milliliters per kilogram per minute to absolute units, which is liters per minute. So we need their body weight for that. So the first thing I always do is convert 17.5 milliliters per kilogram per minute into liters per kilogram per minute. So just move the decimal point over 3 spots, and then multiply that by the body weight. I get 1.2 liters per minute. That is their absolute VO2. Once we have it in absolute units, we just can multiply by what we call the caloric equivalent of oxygen, which is 5 kcals per liter. This is a constant. So 1.231 liters per minute times 5 kcals per liter is going to give me 6.15 kcals per minute. And that's based when they're out walking, or doing this 4 times a week. That's their energy expenditure that we calculate while they're walking, a little over 6 kcals per minute. So if they did this for 240 minutes per week, like we said earlier, 4 times a week for 60 minutes a day, that's going to be about 1476 kcals a week. And again, that is consistent with what we saw in the previous slide. That's over 1,000 kcals a week. It's not at that 2,000 kcal limit yet, but it's on the way. And so we think about this. If this person was doing this and they were comfortable doing it, but they wanted to progress and maybe get to that 2,000 kcals a week, we could just up some of these variables here. They could maybe do it 5 times a week. Probably don't want to do it more than 60 minutes a day, although they could. But probably an easy thing here would just be increase the intensity a little bit. Start exercising at an intensity of 6 METs or 7 METs. And then that's going to increase the MET minutes per week and also the kcals per week. As far as the rate of progression, it just depends on a lot of things, how people are tolerating the exercise, and it also depends a lot on their initial conditions and what their goals are. So general guidelines for aerobic exercise anyway, for the first 4 to 6 weeks, gradually increase the duration. So no intensity changes yet in most cases. Duration should be increased first. So increases 5 to 10 minutes per session about every 1 to 2 weeks, depending on how they're tolerating the exercise program. After that, you go into next 4 to 8 months, gradually start increasing the other components. That's when you can start increasing potentially like the frequency if they wanted to, or more likely the intensity. So you're going to up some of the adaptations that you're actually getting. And so things to consider, generally you want to start small, and then anytime you increase any component of an exercise prescription, you want to monitor the person to see if there's any adverse responses. If somebody says, oh, I'm overly sore and I don't think I can do this anymore because it worked out too hard, you might have to either tone it down a little bit or give them more recovery days to kind of let them slowly adapt to it. And the last thing, general recommendation regarding sedentary time. There's not a whole lot of hardcore recommendations related to this, but in general, though, you do want to reduce sedentary time. So adding short physical activity breaks throughout the day can add to the benefits of exercise, an exercise program. So that could just be getting up from your desk every so often, walking around, coming back. As far as, like I said, there's not clear recommendations regarding frequency, duration, intensity, but generally it's just recommended a light to moderate activity once an hour. So again, if you have an office job and you're sitting there a lot, you're in class a lot, it's nice to get up at least once an hour and just walk around for several minutes just to reduce that amount of time that you're just sitting there.